Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most monumental shifts in modern history, the dramatic disintegration of the Second World. And we're going to explore exactly what that meant for global politics. I mean, if you've ever wondered how a globe-spanning superpower essentially dissolved overnight, you're absolutely in the right place. We're going to thoroughly explain the chapter of history that finally closed the book on the Cold War. Think back to November 9th, 1989. The fall of the Berlin Wall wasn't just, concrete breaking. It was this literal and metaphorical shattering of the entire Cold War divide. For 28 years, this 150-kilometer wall was the ultimate symbol of the stark division between the capitalist West and the communist East. So, when ordinary people finally took hammers and broke it down, it triggered a historic chain reaction. It unified Germany and essentially signaled the beginning of the end for the entire communist bloc. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll cover the Soviet system explained, why the system stagnated, Gorbachev and the collapse, the era of shock therapy, global consequences and conflicts, and we'll wrap up with India's post-communist relations. Part 1. The Soviet system explained. To really understand the collapse, we have to start at the beginning. Following the 1917 Russian Revolution led by Vladimir Lenin, the USSR was born. And this was, without a doubt, one of the biggest attempts in human history to consciously design a society based entirely on equality. Their ambitious goal was to abolish private property and give absolute primacy to the state and the Communist Party. No other political parties were allowed. By the time we get to post-World War II, the Soviets had built a massive, state-directed, planned economy. The government guaranteed basic living standards. We're talking subsidized health, education, and childcare. Plus, they were sitting on vast energy resources like oil and steel and had a domestic consumer industry making everything from pins to cars. At its peak, the Soviet economy was highly developed, literally rivaling only the United States.
Part 2. Why the system stagnated.
So, how exactly do you go from a global industrial powerhouse to a system teetering on the brink of collapse? Well, you can learn a lot from a culture's dark humor. Listen to this joke. Comrade farmer, how has the harvest been this year? Oh, by the grace of God, we had mountains of potatoes. But there is no God. Huh. And there are no mountains of potatoes either. It perfectly highlights the severe disconnect between the Central Party bureaucrats in Moscow and the stark, on-the-ground reality. Without freedom of speech, citizens turned to jokes to point out that the system was totally unaccountable. Because behind those jokes, the reality was incredibly grim. The Soviet economy was hemorrhaging resources to maintain a massive nuclear arsenal and prop up satellite states in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Throw in the 1979 invasion of Afghanistan, and they were bleeding even more. While wages actually grew, productivity completely stalled compared to the West. By the late 70s, the economy was stagnant. There were severe consumer shortages, and embarrassingly, they had to rely on food imports. Citizens were looking at the West's advancements and realizing just how far behind their own system had fallen. Part 3. Gorbachev and the collapse. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev. He takes over as General Secretary in 1985, and he actually diagnoses the problems correctly. He initiates these bold policies to democratize the nation and restructure the economy. His plan? Loosen the administrative grip, catch up with Western tech and information revolutions, and even normalize relations with the West. Sounds good on paper, right? But here's the catch. When you loosen the grip after decades of control, things move fast. Gorbachev gave people a taste of freedom, and it unintentionally sparked massive nationalist movements. In March 85, reforms start. By November 89, the wall is down. By March 90, Lithuania is declaring independence. Gorbachev was caught in a brutal tug-of-war. Hardliners thought he was moving way too fast, and reformers thought he was moving way too slow. The ultimate breaking point hits in 1991. Communist Party hardliners attempt a coup to force a return to the old ways. But Boris Yeltsin steps up and emerges as a national hero. He leads the protests, pushes for Russian sovereignty, and basically says, "No, we're not going back." Power rapidly shifted away from the Soviet center. By December 1991, under Yeltsin's leadership, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine declared the Soviet Union completely disbanded. Part 4. The era of shock therapy. Now we hit the era of shock therapy, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It was a deeply painful, abrupt transition directed by Western institutions, specifically the World Bank and the IMF.
The goal was to force the former Soviet bloc into the global capitalist market overnight. It meant completely dismantling the state-controlled economy, severing old trade alliances, and linking directly to the West.
The tragedy here is the massive disconnect between expectation and reality. People were promised a capitalist utopia, mass consumption, seamless integration. The actual reality, total ruin. It triggered what's often called the largest garage sale in history. 90% of state industries were sold off for pennies. The ruble completely collapsed, hyperinflation wiped out everyone's life savings, the social safety net vanished, and a new mafia stepped in to control the economy. It was devastating and pushed millions into extreme poverty.
Part 5. Global Consequences and Conflicts.
Zooming out, the geopolitical shockwaves were massive and still shape our world today. First off, the terrifying nuclear arms race of the Cold War? Over. Secondly, global power dynamics flipped entirely. The U.S. emerged as the sole superpower in a unipolar, capitalist-dominated world. And third, the map was literally redrawn. Dozens of new independent countries popped up, many of them eager to join Western institutions like the EU and NATO.
But we have to acknowledge that this new map was drawn with a lot of tension. The sudden vacuum of centralized power led to horrific instability. We saw violent secessionist movements and brutal civil wars erupt. Chechnya faced devastating military campaigns. Tajikistan endured a decade-long civil war. And of course, the Balkan republics of Yugoslavia violently broke apart, resulting in inter-ethnic massacres that eventually required NATO intervention.
And finally, Part 6, India's post-communist relations. Looking specifically at regional ties, India and the USSR shared incredibly deep, multi-dimensional connections during the Cold War. Economically, the Soviets helped build Indian steel plants when no one else would. Politically, they provided vital support at the UN, and militarily, they supplied massive amounts of hardware. But it wasn't just geopolitical, it was highly cultural too. Bollywood stars like Raj Kapoor were household names across the Soviet space. And amazingly, that cultural affinity survives today in places like Uzbekistan and Russia.
Obviously, the Soviet Union is gone, but that relationship evolved with modern Russia. Today, India and Russia still collaborate on energy and defense, but the real glue is a shared strategic vision. They both advocate for a multipolar world order. Instead of one single superpower dominating the globe, they envision a system where several powers coexist, using collective security and diplomacy to manage conflicts.
So, as we wrap up this explainer and look back at the spectacular rise, stagnation, and abrupt fall of the Soviet system, we're left with a pretty massive question. We clearly saw the fatal flaws of authoritarian state control, but we also witnessed the sheer devastation of unchecked, abrupt capitalist transitions. As we move forward, what does the ideal system actually look like for a truly multipolar world? Is there an alternative path we just haven't discovered yet? Something to think about. Keep questioning, keep learning, and thanks for joining me today.